Most people have never heard of Melchizedek. There is a man in the Bible who meets Abraham at the height of his greatest victory. Abraham has just defeated 4 kings in battle. He is returning with the spoils, with the rescued captives, with everything. And in that moment, a man comes out to meet him. He brings bread and wine. He speaks a blessing over Abraham. And Abraham, the patriarch chosen by God himself, gives this man 1/10 of everything without being asked. That one moment is all we get. The Bible does not explain who he was before this. It does not tell us what happened to him after. But it gives him 2 titles: King of Salem and Priest of God Most High. A king and a priest at the same time. In a city we can barely locate on a map, worshiping the same God as Abraham before Israel even existed as a nation. His name is Melchizedek. And 1,000 years later, the writers of the New Testament came back to this one quiet scene in Genesis and said this man is the key to understanding who Jesus Christ really is. In this video, we're going to look at every place Melchizedek appears in Scripture, what history tells us about him, what the scholars have debated for centuries, and why this one encounter between 2 men changed the theology of the entire Bible. To understand Melchizedek, you have to understand what was happening the day he appeared. Genesis 14 opens with a war, not a small tribal conflict, a war between 9 kings across the region of Canaan. For kings from the east had formed an alliance and swept through the land, defeating 5 local kings and taking everything they had. Among the captives they carried away was Lot, Abraham's nephew. When Abraham heard that Lot had been taken, he did not hesitate. He gathered 318 trained men from his own household and marched out to fight. They caught up with the enemy forces near Damascus, attacked at night, and drove them back. Every captive was recovered. Every piece of property was returned. Abraham won a battle that professional armies had lost. This is the moment Melchizedek steps into. Genesis 14 verse 18 says it plainly. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. That is the entire introduction. No background. No explanation of how he knew about the battle. No reason given for why he came. He simply appears, brings food and drink, and speaks a blessing over Abraham. The blessing itself matters. Melchizedek said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." Then Abraham gave him 1/10 of everything. Now slow down here, because these few verses carry enormous weight. First, the name Salem. Most scholars identify Salem as the early name for Jerusalem. The Hebrew word shalom, peace, shares the same root. So Melchizedek was likely the king of the city that would later become the most important city in all of Scripture. He was not ruling over some forgotten village. He was the king of a significant place. Second, the title priest of God Most High. The Hebrew phrase used here is El Elyon, God Most High. This is the same God Abraham worshipped, which means Melchizedek was not a pagan priest. He was not serving foreign gods. He was a worshiper of the same God as Abraham, functioning as a priest in Canaan, at a time when no formal priesthood had been established anywhere in the biblical record. This raises a serious question. How did Melchizedek come to know this God? Where did his priesthood come from? The Bible does not say, and that silence is not an accident. Later Scripture will return to it directly. Third, the tithe. Abraham gave Melchizedek 10% of the spoils of war. In the ancient world, you gave a portion of your victory to the one who held spiritual authority over you. This was not a casual gesture. Abraham was acknowledging that Melchizedek held a legitimate priestly position, one that ranked above his own standing before God. And then the contrast in the very next verse makes this even clearer. The king of Sodom approaches Abraham immediately after and offers him the goods. Abraham refuses him completely. He will not take so much as a sandal strap from the king of Sodom. But to Melchizedek, a man he had never met before, he gave freely and without hesitation. That tells you everything about how Abraham read this encounter. Some scholars have pointed out that Melchizedek's offering of bread and wine is itself significant. in a region where victory was typically celebrated with military display. This priest came with food, sustenance, hospitality, blessing. Some in the early church saw in this a foreshadowing of the communion table. Whether you accept that reading or not, the gesture stands apart from everything else happening in Genesis 14. For nearly 1,000 years after Genesis 14, Melchizedek is not mentioned again. Not in Exodus, not in Leviticus, where the entire Levitical priesthood is established in careful detail. Not in the historical books. Not in the writings of the prophets. He simply disappears from the biblical record, until one verse in the Psalms brings him back without warning. Psalm 110. It is one of the most quoted psalms in the entire New Testament. And verse 4 says this, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, in the order of Melchizedek." This psalm is addressed to the coming king, the one David calls as Lord. Jewish tradition understood it as messianic. The one being spoken to would be both a king sitting at God's right hand and a priest forever, not in the Levitical line, but in the order of Melchizedek. That single verse does several things at once. It establishes that Melchizedek represented a type of priesthood, a distinct order, separate from anything that came later through Moses or Aaron. It confirms that this order was not temporary. It was forever, and it connects that eternal priesthood directly to the coming Messiah. Now understand what this meant in its historical context. By the time Psalm 110 was written, Israel had a fully functioning priesthood. The sons of Levi, the descendants of Aaron. Every priest in Israel traced his legitimacy back through that bloodline. The law was clear. Only those born into the right family could serve as priests. It was not a role you could volunteer for or earn. It was inherited. So when Psalm 110 says the coming king would be a priest in the order of Melchizedek, it was saying something radical. It was saying that one day, a priest would come whose authority did not rest on bloodline, whose legitimacy came from somewhere else entirely, from an order that existed before Levi, before Aaron, before the law itself, an order that went all the way back to that one quiet encounter in Genesis 14. This is why the New Testament writers paid such close attention to Melchizedek. They were not reaching for an obscure figure to make a creative argument. They were following a thread that the Psalms had already laid down centuries earlier, a thread pointing directly to a priesthood that operated outside the normal rules. There's also something important to notice about how Psalm 110 describes this priesthood. It says forever, not for a generation, not until a better system comes along. Forever. The Levitical priesthood had a beginning and, as history would show, an end. The order of Melchizedek, by the language of this psalm, does not. Scholars have debated for centuries what exactly David understood when he wrote this. Did he know the full implications of what he was saying? Was this purely prophetic? Words given to him that pointed beyond his own understanding? The text does not answer that directly, but the psalm stands as a formal declaration, sworn by God and recorded in Israel's worship literature, that Melchizedek's order would one day be fulfilled in a specific person. That person, the New Testament argues, is Jesus. And the book of Hebrews is where that argument is made in full. But before we get there, consider what we have established so far. A man appears in Genesis with no recorded origin. He functions as both king and priest of the Most High God in the city that will one day become Jerusalem. Abraham honors him above all others. And then 1,000 years later, God himself swears an oath in the Psalms that the coming Messiah will carry his title forever. The book of Hebrews was written to Jewish Christians who understood the priesthood deeply. They had grown up with it. They knew the law. They knew Aaron. They knew that every legitimate priest in Israel came from the tribe of Levi, and that this system had been given directly by God through Moses. So when a writer of Hebrews wanted to explain why Jesus could function as a high priest, despite coming from the tribe of Judah, not Levi, he needed a solid argument. He went back to Melchizedek. Hebrews chapter 7 is the most extended treatment of Melchizedek anywhere in Scripture. It opens by restating the Genesis account, who Melchizedek was, what he did, what his name and title mean. The writer notes that the name Melchizedek in Hebrew means king of righteousness, and that king of Salem means king of peace. These were not accidental titles. They describe the character of his reign. Then the writer of Hebrews makes a statement that has been discussed ever since. He says Melchizedek was without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God. He remains a priest forever. This verse has produced serious theological debate. What does it mean that he had no beginning of days or end of life? The most straightforward reading, held by most biblical scholars, is that this refers to the written record, not to Melchizedek's literal nature. In the ancient world, priestly legitimacy was proven through genealogical records. You documented your lineage. You proved your ancestry. Melchizedek has none of that in the text, and the writer of Hebrews argues that this absence is itself meaningful. The silence in Genesis is not an oversight. It is a portrait. By having no recorded beginning and no recorded end, Melchizedek in the text resembles, pictures, a priest whose priesthood truly has no end. He points beyond himself to someone greater. The writer then makes the argument about Abraham and the tithe. He says, "Consider how great this man was, that even Abraham the patriarch gave him a tenth of the plunder." And then he takes it further. The Levitical priests also received tithes from the people. That was established by law. But Levi himself, the ancestor of all those priests, was still inside Abraham when Abraham gave the tithe to Melchizedek. In a sense, Levi tithed to Melchizedek through Abraham, which means Melchizedek's priesthood was greater than the Levitical priesthood, not by argument, but by the logic of the scripture itself. Then comes the central point. If the Levitical priesthood had been sufficient, if it had actually accomplished what a priesthood is supposed to accomplish, there would have been no need for another priest to come in the order of Melchizedek. But Psalm 110 said one was coming, which means God himself was signaling that the Levitical system was not the final answer. It was a placeholder, a shadow of something more complete. Jesus, the writer of Hebrews argues, is that something more complete. He came from the tribe of Judah. Under the Mosaic law, he had no right to serve as a priest. But his priesthood does not rest on the law of physical descent. It rests on what Hebrews calls the power of an indestructible life. He became a priest not because of his bloodline, but because of who he is, permanently, unchangeably, forever. And the confirmation of that priesthood is the oath in Psalm 110. God swore it. The Levitical priests were appointed without an oath. Jesus was appointed with one. That difference, Hebrews says, makes him the guarantee of a better covenant. This is the full arc. A mysterious king-priest appears to Abraham. He is honored without question. He disappears from a text. 1,000 years later, God swears an oath in the Psalms, connecting his order to the coming Messiah. And then the New Testament opens that oath up and shows how it was fulfilled. In a priest who does not serve in a temple made with hands, whose sacrifice was made once and does not need to be repeated, and whose priesthood has no end. Melchizedek was not the main character. He was never meant to be. He was a figure placed in the earliest pages of Scripture to point forward, to a priesthood that the Levitical system could only gesture toward. And that is why, of all the people in the Bible, it is this one brief and nameless figure whose title the Son of God carries forever. If this video gave you something to think about, share it with someone who takes Scripture seriously. And if you want to keep going deeper into the people, the places, and the moments in the Bible that most videos skip over, subscribe to this channel. This is what we do here. Every single video. See you in the next one.